It's done to the situation. It hasn't changed it fundamentally, but it's basically made everything worse. Yeah. So you get more and somewhat different focus on this issue of scarring, which I'll talk about later, the harm that's done to people after. And the way impact is understood on an individual and a collective or social level, societal. Then you have this issue of lockdown that we're all experiencing now, for example. And it's issue, for example, on a personal or psychological level, all kinds of issues of isolation, anxiety, depression, yada, 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 which you're familiar with, yeah? And then also on education, yeah? And this is still somewhat ambiguous because it's happening as we speak, and we're not sure of the impact on it, but it's clearly in a negative direction. All these people not going to school and so on, or going to school in a way that's disrupted. And of course, what it's done is change the understanding of who is at risk of falling into a NEET situation. Basically, it's made it, a lot more people are at risk, yeah? Now, of course, youth work, what's the point of youth work in this context? Well, if we're talking about all these issues of isolation and so on, that's fairly good for youth work to deal with. It's more interpersonal activities. And this kind of helping people dealing with NEET situations, again, youth work, it's more about dealing with people is helpful for that. And there's a kind of possibly a silver lining, but it's not for sure, that because we've had to go into this sort of online distance learning thing, it's possible youth work could be involved in helping people use online and distance techniques and innovate with them. But this is yet to be proven. Oh, I gotta go back to it. Oh, there we are. Okay, so there are two sections. We'll first talk about the definition of what NEET is and things that are related to it, and then we'll talk about how this can be addressed. Now, the definition of NEET is very, very simple, and that's also part of the problem with it. It just means not in employment, education, or training. That's it. There's just no more to it. But this simplicity kind of leads to some problems with ambiguity and so on. There are a few other concepts that are good to clarify, because people often get misled by them, and it can be problematic. They misunderstand. So when we talk about unemployment, this is measured in relation to what's called the active population, which is usually considered to be people who are either employed or actively seeking employment, that leads to trouble already. And then when we talk about NEET rates, these are measured over just the total population in a given age group, yeah? So, and it also adds this whole issue of, are they in school or training or something, yeah? Now, there's something called invisible unemployment, or it can be called different things. Some people call it discouraged. It doesn't matter what you call it. What you get is people who are unemployed but are not counted as unemployed because they're not counted as active. Usually that's because they've been unemployed for a long time, or they're not registered officially, or they're not looking for a job formally, though they would like one, but maybe they think they just can't find one, yeah? So often you get the real levels of unemployment can often be higher than the formal ones, or the statistical ones, yeah? To deal with that, oh yeah, and there's another thing too with COVID, to add to this. Because you have this whole issue of precarity and the employment and so on, a lot of young people were not fired when COVID hit. Rather, what happened, they had these short-term contracts, which are just not renewed. So they don't appear in the statistics as having lost a job, yeah? So that's something right now to be aware of. There's this thing called labor force participation rate, which sounds very fancy, don't worry about it. All it means is when you compare the active population, people we consider to be working or whatever, with the actual working age population, the people. When you see shifts in this, like it decreases suddenly, that's a way to identify what we call this hidden unemployment, because suddenly you get all these people who are inactive, and why would that be? Well, it's because there's no employment for them. Okay, and now here we are. So this general term isn't that great, but it does have some use. Think of it on a kind of macro level, like if you're in a labor ministry of a country or the EU or something like that. and you're the minister, you might get some report with a pie chart like this. And in the same way that people might show you one of these slices here, this is the group of the population that's not working for some medical reason, and you don't really need to know what their medical problem is, how many people have a problem with their back or their foot or whatever. The same thing with NEETs. You will get a slice like this, and you don't really need to know much more about their specific situations at this very macro high level. And that's fine at that level. But when you get down to the level of specific people, it's next to useless. Why? Because it's like if you went to a doctor and said, well, you're sick. You're classified as sick. And that's true, but it's no good for what do we actually do to help you, right? But what I'm saying is NEET is kind of like that. I can say you're in a NEET situation, but it's so inexact that it's not really good enough. You have to go deeper into it. That said, it is good to understand this term and be familiar with it, because if you're trying to get funding for a project or something, you're going to have to deal with government agencies, policymakers, things like that. And these are the terms they're using. So of course in life, you speak to people in the language they know, and you need to be able to manipulate that. So this is the key bit. There are two key bits in this first part of the presentation. This is one, so you got to pay attention now, okay? NEET is an umbrella term for a whole bunch of things that are put under this one sort of arching term. It is not a single unitary thing, yeah? Which is say, it's kind of an amalgam, which is to say a combination of a bunch of different things that you put together like they were one thing, yeah? And it's very important to understand this, because trying to deal with a so-called NEET situation as if it were just one thing is guaranteed to lead to failure. It just does not work. And I've seen this, it sounds really obvious, but I've seen this so much. Two things to add to this definition of NEET is that this NEET situation is not part of any kind of personal project of the person, and it's not a voluntary situation. They don't want to be in this situation. Now, why might a person stress that? Because there's such a thing as a false NEET, where people are technically NEET. For example, often if people are traveling and they go away, or for some reason, this is pre-COVID, they're considered not to be working because, well, they're not, and they're not in school. But these are not people who have any kind of problem. Yeah, you get someone like Greta Thunberg. She is technically a young person in a NEET situation, because she's not employed, she doesn't have a job, she's not going to school. But you know, she's fine, right? We don't need to bother her. So there's a certain group you want to focus on that's the real NEETs, yeah. And this is the other important bit. So you got to pay attention at least twice. It's the big thing. So when you talk about NEET situations, there are all kinds of different factors, and they're extremely, they can be completely different. So there are these different things that correlate with finding yourself in a NEET situation. The first one is education. This would be typically either the education in some way is inadequate or not good enough, or a school failure, dropout, or something like that. These situations correlate very strongly with NEET situation. Or then you get immigration, what's called politely in Europe, migrant backgrounds. Yeah, so either the person or the parents are from a migrant background, and this tends to correlate strongly. In other parts of Europe, it's not so much migrants, but ethnic minorities, some kind of outgroup, like the Roma, for example. A lot of places come under a similar situation. And then you get health issues, which is often ignored. So you can have physical health issues. And of course, you have mental health, particularly nowadays, is a significant issue. And then you get family, home life type issues. I don't like, this is from Eurofound, this document. They stress on divorce, but Angela Merkel, for example, is a divorced woman. I don't think she's a problem case, but it's more about the family, home life being problematic. There's some kind of instability, and so it's unhelpful for the person. And then, of course, unemployment, which sounds a bit ridiculous, but what they mean by that is if you're in a situation where, say, the parents don't work, or you're not seeing your neighbors going to work and so on, there's a kind of a transmission from one generation to the other of this environment of unemployment. And of course, household income is a polite way to talk about being poor, poverty. Poor people are disproportionately ending up in these NEET situations. And finally, location is the other really big correlating factor, yeah. So you're in a place that for one reason or another is not conducive to opportunity. This might often be some kind of rural environment where there aren't many jobs, there's not a lot of opportunity, but it could also be like an urban environment where there's some kind of ghetto type setting, which is stigmatizing for the person. But the point being that you're in a place where it's not so helpful to be. And of course, there's the big little detail that very often in life, people have more than one problem. Now, of course, we'll just go over this really quickly. The whole NEET profile, it changes radically person to person, place to place. So if we look at just different places, say, for example, here, these are levels of education, and it's all over the map, yeah? So in some places, NEET situations are more associated with low levels of education. In some cases, it's more high levels of education, like people who are very educated but can't find a job. And in some places, it's a mid-level thing. You just get everything. Gender, likewise, you get in some cases it's more of a male thing, some cases it's more of a female thing. In some places it's nothing, it's both, but there's no particular gender issue at all. Then in terms of course, geographical variety in Europe. Now, depending which literature you read, there are all kinds of groupings, and you can never stop dividing this stuff up. But broadly, when people talk about at least the EU, you tend to see like north, south, and east is the typical framework in people's heads. So we're thinking, say, north, think the Netherlands, Scandinavia, that kind of thing. Typically in these places, it's associated with low levels of education and some kind of disadvantage. The person has some thing they're coping with or something. Yeah. In the South, what's politely called structural problems, which means large-scale unemployment. So it's not so much about the individual person having a disadvantage, but just there aren't the jobs. Yeah, the situation is just structurally difficult. And of course, in the East, and this is extremely simplified and generalizing, but you get a somewhat different situation, and it varies from country to country. But one thing I find interesting is that in the East, you find it's often the mid-level education people that are falling into these situations. So you get people with high levels of education, you've got an advanced degree in computer science or something, and they're fine. And then people with low levels of education are able to still find a place for themselves, yeah? And it's the people who sort of fall in between that get hit. That you also see a lot of issues with family responsibilities, having to stay home and take care of a relative or something like that being an issue. Here we get Eurostat, which is a good service, and you get the data for different countries about NEET numbers over the years. And now, of course, we're not going to go through this now, but you can have a look later. Since we've got a lot of Turkish people, I thought we'd look at Turkey. So you see these numbers now it's around, the most recent is around 30-something% of NEET levels. Now, if you play with these stats and say, look at gender, we go to female, and then suddenly we see 44.7. So it's a lot higher for female and significantly lower for males, though it's still significant. So we'd see that in a country like Turkey, the gender issue is particularly important for understanding NEET situations in a way that it might not be everywhere. Yeah. And then other people can talk to you later about this being to do with house girls and these issues, but it's not for me to tell you about your own country. So why is this a big deal? Why is it harmful? Why do we care? The harm or sort of negativity, however you wish to phrase it, can be looked at in various ways. There's a thing in economics called hysteresis, which in the more common literature you might have seen is called scarring. And what that's about is not why it's not good to be in this situation because it's bad, but why after it can also be bad, why it can have effects farther down the road. And then, of course, when we talk about negativity or harm, you have to look at both how this affects the people who are going through this experience themselves, but also how it affects everyone else, society in general. And both of these things are an issue. So the people going through a NEET situation, the kind of harm to them during this and after can be looked at in various ways. We took, in a personal level, you could talk about things like isolation, that's a big issue. There are all kinds of health issues, social exclusion issues, continuing problems with employment, poverty, et cetera, increased likelihood of substance abuse, problems with the police. It's this long shopping list of negative, yucky things. So that's kind of intuitively fairly clear. And if we look at a social level, we talk about issues of alienation and decreased levels of political interest. And this sounds a little bit sort of idealistic, but this disconnection and engagement. And what I find personally quite disturbing is this idea, lower levels of trust in other people. And important to understand it is that when they say this, it's not about lack of trust in some politician that they see on a screen somewhere or something like that, but just the actual people that are all around us. Like if they're on a bus, the people who are on the bus with them, like just decreasing levels in faith in other people, which is a very ugly, ugly idea. And of course, the longer the situation goes on, the worse it gets, which is intuitively obvious, and the more difficult it is to get out of it. Yeah, that's something to keep in mind, and of course, why you want to act earlier. Collectively, as a society, why is it bad for everyone else? Well, we can divide this up. You get on a public level, like governments and things, you get a decreasing level of revenue, like because these people aren't working, so they're not paying taxes and spending money and so on. And of course, your expenses go up because you have all these social benefits and programs you have to pay. So from that point of view, it's a problem. From the point of view of the private sector and the economy and so on and so forth, it's actually quite significant. There's some statistics down below it you could look at, which aren't really important to talk about how they're formed and so on. But the point is to understand that economically, it's of a very significant scale. So you get loss of economic growth, competitiveness, things like that. And it's not a joke, it's actually quite serious. And then socially, we could talk about the social fabric, society, our countries just being less good places to be, decreased qualities of sort of the qualities of our democracies, which sounds really kind of woo-woo, but it's actually true. You have all these people who are disengaged, don't believe in what's going on in society, and that don't feel that it relates to them. This is a problem for us collectively. And then it's an important thing to understand, which is generally ignored in these discussions, is a thing called dependency ratios. And that is simply how many people are working to support how many people who are not working. Usually this is focused on people who are retired, older people, who are on pensions and so on. And you think, well, what does that have to do with this? Well, it's important because the problems of older people and younger people are connected, yeah? They're just the same problem looked at from different angles. If we have in our societies all this aging, which you see here, these different countries, yeah? And then we're saying, so there'll be less and less people working to support more and more old people who are retired. And then we add to that, oh, by the way, we're going to have all these nasty sort of hysteresis things Ian's talking about why this will be more difficult for them to work and be productive and healthy and happy in a strong way. Well, that's a slow motion train wreck that we're watching in front of us right now. So you see countries like, say, Japan or some of the Southern European countries like Spain have particularly high rates of projected like aging populations, yeah? But even a country like, say, Turkey, which looks good on this graphic compared to the others, has pretty significant numbers. Like if you looked at that, not comparing it to the others, you'd say, well, this is going to be a real problem here. So this issue of the aging of our populations is very important and has to do with this. So that's it. That's the intermission. It's Q&A. You can ask me any questions if you like, because it's a simple thing trying to explain a lot of complicated things. So here we are. I have to get this thing. Okay, so it's worked. So what do we do about this thing? We've discussed the term and why it's all nasty and so on. So this is someone, it's possible some of you might have met. He goes to a lot of these sort of youth Salto type events. So that's where I first met him. He's a psychologist in Lithuania, and I was discussing this with him. And from his point of view, because he's a psychologist, he said you would talk about a NEET situation as a form of trauma in a psychological term, yeah? Which is like a negative experience that has an impact on the person. He says, and in general, the way you deal with trauma from a psychological point of view is you try and give a person the opposite experience to that of the traumatic experience. So what that would mean for our purposes is if, for example, if you have a person who's experienced a lot of isolation, it's a common NEET problem, yeah? Well, then you would try and give them an experience of connectivity, of being connected to other people. If you have a person who's undergone a lot of rejection, which is typical of job seekers in a time when, you know, it's not good, repeated rejection, so you would want to give them an experience of acceptance, etc. So when you're designing an intervention around all this sort of NEET stuff that we're talking about, that's a general guiding principle to keep it around. You want to, as an experience, you want to flip it, okay? So in the book, we have various practices here that we covered, and the idea was to get a selection that would show about how you can respond to different kinds of situations, different kinds of problems, You can never get a complete list because it's infinite, it never stops. But the idea was to give you a variety so you can understand how lots of different approaches could come into this, yeah? So the first one is one from Estonia. They stay when they have a say. This is addressing issues of people in these low opportunity, somewhat rural areas. And what they did was a kind of very innovative involvement of young people in the governance of the locality, and it had some very interesting results and was really innovative. And it's interesting too because you can innovate in very small rural places as well as in Tokyo or something. Right? The other one here, Eco Herbal, this is one from Romania addressing a similar kind of situation. These like low opportunity rural areas, in this case in Romania. But what they did is a kind of a social enterprise that created new kinds of jobs and innovated in that way. And it was extremely successful. They won all kinds of awards and it was good. This one here, these two are from the Netherlands. Rooms with Hope addresses this issue of the home environment being a problem. There's some kind of instability in the home. And of course, there are multiple factors that come into it, not just the home, but this is the central issue. So they created a kind of alternate home environment for these people. And there was a very strong emphasis on co-creation. So you're involving the person in creating the pathway for themselves. You're not just doing it to them, yeah? The other one was also very strong in this way. Moyo Studio Moyo is another Dutch one. This was a social enterprise and put a lot of emphasis on creativity as part of the process for working with people in a NEET situation. And it was very innovative in a lot of strange ways. You have like kickboxing and elderly people and very strange and weird things that were actually oddly effective. Skuna, this is one from Slovenia. And this is interesting because you see this issue of empowerment, this horrible word that we use too much, yeah? Because it's by the group, for the group. This is targeting migrant people, but it's also done by migrants, yeah? So it's involving them in their own solution. They're not receiving some kind of charity from the other group, yeah? It focused nominally on building employability of these people, but also did a lot to address the perception of migrants in the host community, in the general Slovene community, turning into something interesting as opposed to threatening. The next one is from Ireland. This means welcome in Irish. And nominally, this is about language training for migrants, but the real substance of it is integrating migrant people in their local communities, building linkages with the people who are already there. And one interesting factor of it, aside from it being very successful, is that it's very low cost. And that's, of course, important for sustainability and for transferring it to other places, yeah? So this would be fairly easy to adopt, and it worked very well. The next one's a Polish one, right? This is targeting people with physical disabilities of some kind. So particularly a lot of them were people with hearing problems, so that they would speak in sign language and things like that. And the approach was one of changing the setting. So they would take them to different places and give them experiences outside of the normal environment. The idea being that you change the setting of a person, it can change their mindset, yeah? And what they stressed a lot in this is supporting it and doing it in a way where it's positive. Because if you take a person maybe who's handicapped and you send them to an environment where they don't do well, it's not adapted to them, it can be traumatic and then they never want to go again. Whereas if you do it well, you can really get them into a new place in their thinking, yeah? So, and the importance of it, making sure what you do is adapted to the people you're doing it for. The next one's from Slovakia. It's also the same sort of approach about changing a setting of a person to sort of reboot how they're thinking about things. And again, the stress on this was to think of this, first of all, you don't just send people off like that. Why are you sending them to where, to what, why this person and that activity or that place? Before, there's a build up to it, and then there's a plan for after. So you're making these experiences part of a larger pathway for this person. You don't just say, well, let's do an EVS or whatever it may be, and then off they go, because that doesn't go well. Now, of course, educational problems, school failure, are one of the most common factors related to ending up in a NEET situation. So, of course, what you might want to do is reform education systems. Yeah, and this is an example, the VET reform from Cyprus, where they had very high levels of school failure in their system there. And they did these reforms, which have very good effects. The school failure, dropout rates were reduced significantly. And what they did was just adapt the system better to the people that were in it and what their needs were and understanding their needs better and so on. And they got results, so that was good. And then the final one here is also from Estonia, and it's much like what we're doing now. If you're talking about a given group, in this case, say young people, in the same way you might address them to affect them, you can also address the people around them to affect them. So you have, say, teachers, youth workers, parents, etc. The way these people are and behave affects these other young people. So this was a program that did that. And the idea was capacity building for teachers and youth workers and so on, and awareness raising around this issue of NEETs as a way to deal with this issue. And it's much like what we're doing now. Now, those were the practices, and these are the principles. We've just got these two slides now that sort of drew from them. Yeah. The first one is this whole issue of the concept of NEET being all these different things in one thing, and pursuing it as if it were one thing is functionally dysfunctional. This doesn't work. Yeah. So that has to be made really clear, even though it sounds obvious. Also, in many cases, people will already be doing these things, but they haven't framed them in terms of being an action addressing the NEET issue, particularly if they're not in English. That, why would we talk about NEETs if we're not even speaking English? Yeah. So a lot of people are actually already doing it. They just don't realize it. Also, it's not necessarily about doing something new, like maybe you're teaching music or something, and it's not like you change that, but being aware of how it relates to this issue, or maybe how it can be adapted to take into account certain factors of this issue. It's not about making youth workers or teachers into something else, yeah? And of course, if we're talking about NEET situations, a large part of overcoming this or addressing it involves interpersonal issues and generic skills. And of course, as youth workers know, this is the kind of thing youth work is good at. Now, the next thing is this issue of supply and demand, which sounds kind of abstruse for our context, but this is important because when we talk about a labor market, you have what they call supply issues and demand issues. Supply is basically when there are jobs, and then the problem is getting people who can do them. In those cases, what you address is improving their skills. You give them maybe classes on how to do a job interview, how to do their CV, and all that's fine, right? Maybe they do computer skills development, they learn English or whatever, and that's fine. But when there's a demand problem, that means that they just don't want anyone. Yeah, there aren't jobs for people. So it's these situations where you get like one job opening and 200 people apply, 199 people are going to have an unhappy result. Even the person who gets the job might not be happy because maybe the job's not very good, it doesn't pay well. So that's what we're in now, basically. And this is very important for youth work to understand. It's not about, in a moment like this, necessarily, you don't want to give up on people having an outcome, but you have to understand that we're in a negative situation. So a lot of what you might want to do is harm reduction, making the situation less bad. What can you do to address this and help? Yeah, and you're not going to suddenly turn around the world and make it unlike how it actually is. Yeah. So how can you address it and help people be better in the situation as it actually is? Yeah, and that's particularly nowadays because we're in this pretty nasty moment. So there's no point in denying it. Now, partnership. This is important. Most of these exercises involve working with other people, which generally is a good thing in life. And often I talk about this stuff, like say supply and demand in the labor market. People say, well, Ian, why are you telling me about this? I'm a youth worker. This is like for economists or something. Well, it's not about turning youth workers into something that they're not, but rather seeing what they do as part of a larger picture and how this fits in. And say the same young person who's maybe involved in some youth work activity might, is experiencing other things in the rest of their life in society. And you want to see that complete picture. And of course, if we're talking about partnership, one of the key partners are the young people themselves. Yeah. So it's very important to involve them and to learn from them, not just thinking in terms of doing it to them. The Dutch case, Studio Moyo, was very strong on this, and the idea of actually learning from the young people that would be involved, like extracting from them as opposed to doing to them. Yeah. Again, these things sound very obvious as things you might say, but in practice, not so much. Yeah. And then, of course, adapting education, training activities to the young people that we actually have with us, to how they really are, which is another thing that sounds obvious, but in the world, it's something that happens not as much as it should. Then if we're talking about things like EVS or these other experiences where it's to do with volunteering or sending someone somewhere, these can be very positive, but it's important to understand there are also significant risks with this. And you have to be aware of that if you're going to pursue these kinds of experiences. Now, if we have what's called a disengaged person, like people who aren't participating and they feel alienated, none of this is about me, which is typically associated particularly with long-term need situations. By definition, these people are not obvious candidates for volunteering, yeah? So if you're going to pursue that kind of approach, there has to be a process of moving a person from one space to another space for that experience to make sense. The experience itself has to fit with them and who they are and where they're at. It makes sense for, and there has to be a plan for after. It's not just you sort of catapult people off on these things and you're done. You have to see it as a beginning, middle, and end, a larger pathway. Again, the example from Slovakia emphasized this very well, I think, which is why we put it in, yeah? Then when we talk about areas, like these remote areas where there isn't a lot of opportunity, there tends to be a drift, and it's not done on purpose. It just, because it happens functionally, where you provide services or interventions, things people can do, where it's easier to do them, right? So you might see, say, in a country like Estonia, all kinds of like cultural offer and activities being available for young people. In a place like Tallinn or Tartu, yeah, these major cities of the country, and not so much in these more forgotten places. So basically the forgotten places have to not be forgotten. Yeah? So when you're designing interventions, think of these places they're out of the way, yeah? Because that's typically no one thinks about them, yeah? And it's particularly important where you get issues of depopulation and overload on certain capital cities. You see this like in say France or England, where you get everyone's grouping around the capital city and it just keeps building and building, and it's really unworkable. There's a certain city called Istanbul, which is not the smallest place in the world, where you see this as well. ASAP, intervene as early as possible. This is fundamental, yeah? So and again, it's important for youth work because there has to be a direct contact with people to identify the need to intervene. So our imaginary person in some Ministry of Labor civil servant is not going to be able to do that. It's more people who are working with young people. And of course, the ideal NEET situation is the one that never happens. Prevention is the gold standard. That's the ideal outcome, yeah? Is that this is prevented before it even happens, yeah? So that ideally that's, and again, to see that there's this risk and to do something about it needs people who are really on the ground in a direct kind of contact. Yeah, it can't really come from these sort of upper, more macro levels of policy and action and so on. That's for other stuff. And again, youth work obviously fits in because it's about dealing with young people. Yeah? These terms like value and agency, this sort of abstract, but one, for example, in the Dutch example, Moyo is very good in terms of, without being unrealistic, not focusing on negativity in terms of, like, say, defining a person by their problem. Yeah, a person can have a problem, but that's not, how you describe them, like wheelchair guy. It's not really how you want to see a person, right? A person might be in a wheelchair, but that's not them. Yeah. And again, that sounds a bit sort of woo abstract, but it's important because we design these programs and we identify who they're for, and you're kind of labeling them. So it's important to be just be aware of that, how you frame some of these things without ignoring problems. Yeah. And then also, if we're talking about alienation, not getting involved, being disengaged, not participating, being excluded, all these sorts of terms, then if in our own practice, we're doing it like where we design something and kind of do it to the person we design it for, that doesn't make any sense. We're perpetuating the same process. There has to be an involvement of the people we're working with. And this isn't just young people, you could say it for any group, yeah? They have to be involved in what's going on that's meant for them. Particularly if we're saying the problem is that they're not being involved. So And people don't do these things on purpose, of course. They just don't realize there's a process that leads them into doing so. Being very aware of the idea of agency or involving people in the thing that's for them. Again, the two Dutch examples were very strong in this regard. Yeah. Let's see if I can get, did it work? Oh, I'm clicking my little button thingy. It's not moving then. Okay. So this is, in the past, I've done variations on this presentation, and I used to try and end because there's all this negativity. I'm talking about harm and people being depressed and isolated. You know, it's a downer, right? So I would try and do something upbeat to make it nice at the end. So I'd say something cute about, or trying to be cute about, even a train that's gone off track. There's hope it can get back on track. You know, that's the title of the book, and so on. And, you know, try and end it on a positive spirit. And that's how, and now I don't want to abandon hope and that kind of thing. So I felt bad about taking it out. So I left it in, but I thought for the current context, I wanted to use a different visual metaphor. Now, if we're talking about a NEET situation, there are all these different aspects to it. And more specifically, if we're talking about our current context with COVID, and, you know, you're all aware of this. If we look at that, we could talk about, say, a health issue. We could talk about all the sort of economic employment stuff that are ramifications of this. And we can talk about all the social and personal implications and things that are happening because of all that. What I'm saying with this, and it's not just me who's had this idea, you can't talk about one of these things or two of these things and separate them from another. We can't say, we'll address some of these issues and leave this other thing for later. If you want to address the situation that we're dealing with, we have to address all those things at the same time. Much like if you have a stool, you have three legs, you can't take away one. It has to all come together. And all the sort of social, interpersonal stuff that has to be addressed along with everything else that we're in. And of course, here, these are two photos I took from an event we had a year ago, which seems an impossible age ago, in Istanbul. And I wanted to think about this and look forward to when we can meet like this again.